Hey friends, today on Exploring Revelation, we are in chapter 6. It's entitled Wrath of the Lamb. We're going to be looking at vengeance and judgment. And of course, all vengeance is the Lord's. And we see that taking place as the seals are now going to be broken open in chapter 6. We're also going to be looking at the Four Horsemen, underground facilities, and of course, as we go through Revelation, we take a few approaches. Four in fact. One, we look at the historical significance of the past and how that would have influenced the book of Revelation. So that's the Old Testament, but also recent events that would have shaped how the early church would have seen things. And the better we can understand that, the better we can understand Revelation. But we also know that the book of Revelation is future-oriented, which is it's prophetic. So it's reaching into the future as well. It's speaking about things that are to come. So we always want to think about that as well. And then we're going to want to look at archetypes. So if there's a model or if there's a certain image, it's probably going to reoccur throughout human history. And then finally, of course, through all this, we want to notice God's plan, right? His divine providence all throughout the book of Revelation. Okay, let's dig in and let's go to Revelation chapter 6, beginning with verse 1. As I watched, the Lamb broke the first of the 7 seals on the scroll. So the scroll is being opened up slowly and surely. The seals are being torn from it. And here we have the Lamb doing that. The Lamb being Jesus, the only one who can, because he is absolutely perfect. He is the perfect balance between power and love, between justice and grace. And we see that in Jesus. And what are we going to notice in this chapter? Well, the Four Horsemen. And so we see the Four Horsemen all throughout popular culture. The X-Men, had an opponent, Apocalypse, I think his name was, and he had his Four Horsemen. And then there's cowboy movies entitled The Four Horsemen. People get tattoos, there's artwork, there's paintings. And then there was a WCW wrestling stable called the Four Horsemen. And those guys were Ric Flair, Arn, and Ole Anderson, and Tully Blanchard. So shout out to them back in the day, winning all sorts of belts known as the Four Horsemen. But we also find the Four Horsemen in the Old Testament, or at least the idea starting to percolate in the Old Testament. It really comes to fruition here in Revelation chapter 6. And I'll give a few examples of that. We see it in Zechariah 1:8. In a vision during the night, I saw a man sitting on a red horse that was standing among some myrtle trees in a small valley. Behind him were riders on red, brown, and white horses. So you kind of get a hint of it there. It's not explicit. And in the same book, in chapter 6, 1 verse 3, you really get to see this idea of the horsemen, right? And so check it out. Then I looked up again and saw 4 chariots coming from between 2 bronze mountains. The first chariot was pulled by red horses, the second by black, third by white, and the fourth by powerful dappled gray horses. So there you have it, the model of the Four Horsemen being found in Zechariah. But it's being fused also with the idea that when war comes along, so do a lot of other things as well. And this is a common archetype, and it's something that you can't get away from. If pestilence comes, it usually means famine, which is going to mean war perhaps. And a lot of times they're intertwined, and when one comes, usually the rest follow as well. And we see an example of this in Ezekiel 14:21. Now this is what the Sovereign Lord says: how terrible it will be when all 4 of these dreadful punishments fall upon Jerusalem: war, famine, wild animals, and disease, destroying all her people and animals. So the 4 horsemen are to be dreaded because they're part of God's punishment, they're part of God's justice, right? This idea that vengeance is the Lord's, and he's the one that passed judgment. And so when they come, they're to be feared. So here's a painting from the 1800s, and you can see the 4 horsemen coming from heaven. They are divinely appointed, and they are now going to pass certain judgment onto the people of the earth. Here's an example of a horse that's quite menacing. This is from actually the Denver airport. You may have seen this before. It's very strange and bizarre, and the backstory is very bizarre too. In fact, the whole airport has a really strange and apocalyptic story to it. So you can always go and check that out and do some digging around, on the internet. Okay, let's get back into Revelation though. So finishing up verse 1 and then getting into verse 2. Then I heard one of the four living beings say with a voice like thunder, "Come." I looked up and saw a white horse standing there. Its rider carried a bow, and a crown was placed on his head. He rode out to win many battles and gain the victory. So this rider doesn't have a sword, though he is on a white horse. And Jesus eventually in the book of Revelation comes on a white horse and with a sword. And in Revelation 1, we see Jesus has a sword that comes out of his mouth. So the sword and Christ and a horse and all that imagery comes together. And so some people have said, well, this is a white horse. Obviously, the rider's got to be Jesus on it. But we're uncertain because some people also think the complete opposite. They think that this might be the Antichrist as well. Well, we only know a few things from the passage that's given here. One being that the rider is clothed in white. And we know that the victory is to be gained, right, in the battle. And usually, if you're dressed in white, it means that you won a battle. It means that you are the conqueror. And so what we know for sure is that whatever this person represents, it is war, conquest, and victory. They are going to be victorious as they go out as part of God's judgment. Remember, it's not just God's judgment, it's the judgment of Christ as well, for he's the one opening up the seals. And that's important to note. Okay, what's another part of the image here is we got the bow. No one knows for sure why this rider's carrying a bow. Some people have speculated, well, maybe it's a bow of peace because, maybe like a rainbow, or it's supposed to remind us of God's covenant because there's no mention of arrows. But if I say gun, you usually think there's bullets involved with it too. And often when we think of bow, we think of arrows as well. So I don't really buy that argument, as compelling as it might sound. Plus there's a crown that this person has on their head too, which is also compelling as well. So they're of royalty, or at least a victor in something. And of course, as I noted, a victor in war or conquest. I did some research and digging around because it's a really odd image that's being given here compared to the rest of the horses. The rest of the horsemen make sense, but this first one is a little bit strange in this way that it has a bow. And so I thought, well, maybe within the Roman army, they had guys sitting on top of horses with bows. And sure enough, they did. They were called equitus sagittaria. So that's basically bowmen on horses. And they weren't very prominent, though. I didn't find a whole lot of evidence to support that these were important troops. In fact, quite the opposite. If they did have bowmen, usually they were on foot, not on horses. And so maybe this is a bit more of a rare thing. Or maybe it's an allusion to something else historical, but I couldn't really find anything there. Regardless to say, that which, he that which has the bow here also has the victory. And so he's going to go forward with victory in mind. Okay, let's get to the second seal. When the Lamb broke the second seal, I heard the second living being say, "Come." Then another horse appeared, a red one. Its rider was given a mighty sword and the authority to take peace from the earth, and there was war and slaughter everywhere. So this one's fairly straightforward. Obviously, this one represents war. Red has always represented warfare, blood, etc., rage, anger, all those things. But also, there's a few other things that are going on here. The Jewish war, which had only happened about 25 years previous to this, in 66 through 70 AD, was the downfall of not just Jerusalem, but Israel as well. And the temple was destroyed by the Romans, which was absolutely horrific to them. But also, it was a way for many of them, as they interpreted, many of the Israelites and Christians as they interpreted, they thought this was God's punishment, this judgment on Israel for their unfaithfulness and for serving other gods. And so they could see then the second horse here coming and riding in with the sword. It also might be a rebuke, though, to the Romans, because the Romans had a notion of Pax Romana, which was the idea that Rome can instill peace through conquest. So as they conquered the known world at the time, well, their known world anyways, they thought they were bringing peace as well. And that's a half-truth. They were, but only through the sword, and better to bring peace through other means rather than the sword. When the Lamb broke the third seal, I heard the third living being say, "Come." I looked up and saw a black horse, and its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice from among the four living beings say, "A loaf of wheat bread or 3 loaves of barley will cost a day's pay, and don't waste the olive oil and wine." So when war happens, inflation also takes place too. because war is quite costly. It's costly on resources. It's costly on food. In fact, many war efforts have sucked up food from villages and towns in ancient times, and even in World War II, we had a problem with finding enough protein for families, and so we had to resort to eating liver and kidney and all those things, the organs of the animals that we typically would throw out and we didn't bother with. But we had to include them into our recipes and onto the kitchen table in order to help sustain the West. So we know that when war takes place, it has a grave effect on the economy as well. And these horses tend to travel with one another as a pack. And sometimes the economy is going down, and so war begins, or sometimes you have disease and then war begins, and so forth. So it's not always in a straightforward pattern, but usually they're together in one way or another. We also know that inflation happens too, because in order to go to war, you have to pay your soldiers, and often you would have to hire mercenaries to help you win the war. And what would happen in some city-states and in some nations in ancient times is that they would clip coins. And so then they would take the clippings from the coins, melt them down, and make new coins. And then they'd be able to pay their mercenaries and their military and so forth, because they hadn't budgeted for the war. Well, what happens is then you've got a coin that's clipped, and it's worth less now. And so when you go into the marketplace, you'd have to have 2 coins rather than 1 coin for what you'd usually buy. And this was a real pain, because now you would still be making the same amount as you did before, but it was worth less. That's the problem with inflation. And so the inflation they're talking about here is about 5 to 12 times the regular amount, which is quite high, especially up to the 12 percentage mark, but or times mark, multiplication mark. But it's to be noted as well that that this is part of God's judgment and part of his vengeance too. And so all of this is unfolding as part of God's plan. And it's really hard for us to understand this, but when we get to the next verse, it may be easier for us to understand. So Revelation 6:7 says, "When the Lamb broke the 4th seal, I heard the 4th living being say, 'Come.' And then in verse 8, I looked up and saw a horse whose color was pale green. Its rider was named Death, and his companion was the grave. Grave there can be interpreted Hades. These two were given authority over 1/4 of the earth to kill with the sword and famine and disease and wild animals." So they're allowed to depopulate. And this is something that really goes against the grain of what we think when we think God, because in Genesis, God said, "Be fruitful and multiply." But now the opposite's going on, because God is judging the world, and Judgment Day is coming. And so Revelation's taking place, and all these horrific things are happening. And a lot of people, they don't like to hear that, and I don't blame them. No one wants to think of God as someone who passes judgment and someone who can eliminate you. That's furthest from our mind most of the time. We just want to get on with our lives. But if we ignore that aspect of God, the very possibility that God could do those sorts of things, then what will happen is people will start taking it upon themselves to be that way. And better for God to be that than for people. Because when people do it, they never pass perfect judgment, whereas God can. Remember, vengeance is the Lord's. So, just to prove my point that people are out and about and doing these sorts of things, I want to turn your attention to, maybe some of you know about this, but maybe some of you don't, the Georgia Guidestones. You can find these Guidestones out in Georgia, right close to Athens, Georgia. So not too far from Athens, Georgia. And I think they're out basically in the middle of a field. There isn't much around. These are massive blocks of stone. And they have these commandments that are written on them. But they're different than the commandments that you're used to. The first commandment on it says, maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature. So whoever set these up, and we're not sure who did, although I think it was the Rosicrucians who are based out of Athens, Georgia, but I can't be sure. Whoever set these up, they're taking upon they're taking upon themselves to be the judge of humanity, and that humanity is only to be 500 million. Well, there's billions of people, so who's to go? And why is it that they can make those decisions? I would encourage you to check this out, because there is a lot of stuff like this going on right now in the world. And there are a lot of people who are serious about this as well. And so you should be informed so that you can make decisions based on the information that you have as a free thinker. Okay, let's keep going and let's go back into Revelation chapter 6 here, verse 9 through 11. When the Lamb broke the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of all who had been martyred for the Lord of God and for being faithful in their testimony. They shouted to the Lord and said, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you judge the people who belong to this world and avenge our blood for what they have done to us? Then a white robe was given to each of them, and they were told to rest a little longer until the full number of their brothers and sisters, their fellow servants of Jesus who were to be martyred, had joined them. So this is an old idea that we find as well in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 32:43 says, Rejoice with him, you heavens, and let all of God's angels worship him. Rejoice with this people, you Gentiles, and let all the angels be strengthened in him. For he will avenge the blood of his children. He will take revenge against his enemies. He will repay those who hate him and cleanse his people's lands. So the idea that God is the one who will execute vengeance and justice has been around for a long time. And it's good to keep it that way, because if we try to do it, we'll be imperfect in what we do. Now, that's not to say that we're not supposed to have laws and guidelines and, that there isn't supposed to be, I can't remember the word right now. This is great. That there isn't supposed to be consequences, there it is, for our actions. Of course there is. But ultimately, vengeance is the Lord's, right? And so this is what we see with the martyrs. Now, the martyrs are found under the altar, and this is really important to note for a few reasons. The first being that this was probably a phrase that had been used during the early church for those who had been martyred. They'd be known as those under the altar. But then secondly, in ancient times, if you were being besieged by another tribe or another nation, quite often people then from your country or your city would then go and find a temple, and they would go under the altar of their god, looking for their god to rescue them. But here we find that they're under the true altar, and they are looking for God to have vengeance. And he will avenge their blood, he says, but they have to wait, and he's given them white robes, which means they're victorious in him. Paul understood this as well, and he gives good advice to Timothy in 2 Timothy 1:8. He says, Never be ashamed to tell others about our Lord, and don't be ashamed of me either, even though I'm in prison for him. With the strength God gives you, be ready to suffer with me for the sake of the good news. So we understand and know that martyrdom and persecution with the early Christians was widespread and had been going on for quite some time. This is still going on, though, in the world. And you can go to a website that's very informative and helpful in giving you information on this. It's called opendoorsusa.org. That's opendoorsusa.org. So you can go visit that, and they'll give you information. There's maps. They'll tell you the level of persecution in countries. And so this will give you a better idea of what some of our other brothers and sisters are going through at this time as well. Okay. So when we continue on in Revelation 6, starting in verse 12, we read this. I watched as the Lamb broke the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake. The sun became as dark as black cloth, and the moon became as red as blood. Then the stars of the sky fell to the earth like green figs falling from a tree, shaken by a strong wind. The sky was rolled up like a scroll, and all the mountains and islands were moved from their places. So the way that we think about this earth is not the same way that they would have thought of earth at all. We think of it as, well, a globe. They didn't see it like that, right? They saw it a little bit more flat than that. And so here's a good description of it, and you can see. And imagine the stars falling out of the sky, and imagine the blood turning red and the sun being blotted out, and all of these horrific things that were going on. Well, these were all a telltale sign that God's judgment had come on earth. But they were all happening at once. They weren't just happening, with long stretches of time in between. It was all a big cataclysmic event. And we know this because what happens? What does everyone do? Well, as we continue to read and finish off the chapter, we read that everyone, the kings of the earth, the rulers, the generals, the wealthy, the powerful, and every slave and free person, all hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they cried to the mountains and the rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of the one who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to survive?" So they find themselves hiding in caves. And yes, people have done that. They've hidden in caves and tried to hide away from God. We read about in Isaiah 2:10, "Crawl into caves in the rocks, hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty." Or Hosea 10:8, "In the pagan shrines of Avon, the place of Israel's sin will crumble. Thorns and thistles will grow up around the altars. They will beg the mountains, bury us, and plead with the hills, fall on us." So when you encounter the Holy One, you usually want to run from him if you ain't right with him. And the good news is we got Jesus, so we can get right with him. Well, you might ask yourself, are people still burying themselves and hiding under mountains and all of that? And the short answer is yes, of course they are. There was a movie a while ago called 12 Monkeys. You should watch it. You might be a little freaked out after you watch it though, but you should still check it out. And it's about a pandemic that swept the earth, and now people have to live underground. So you could check that out. I'm sure it's on Netflix or something. But there are major installations underground that have been built by the U.S. government as well as other governments as well, because governments have to have continuity plans. So if everything falls apart, they got to be able to still operate. And that usually means that they got to have some sort of safe place. And if you have the potential for nuclear warfare, then you have to have underground bases. And we got plenty of those. We use them actually right now, and you can go to the Ozarks and check them out. And there's other places too where we have food storage that's going on. We have offices and labs in them, and miles and miles and miles of tunnels. I grew up in a mining town, so I know the possibility of this, and I know how easy it is to construct these things. We have them all over the place. The truth is, though, you can't escape God's judgment day. Malachi 3:2 says, "But who will be able to endure it when he comes? Who will be able to stand and face him when he appears? For he will be like a blazing fire that refines metal, or like a strong soap that bleaches clothes." 2 Peter 3:10, "But the day of the Lord will come unexpectedly as a thief. Then the heavens will pass away with a terrible noise, and the very elements themselves will disappear in fire, and the earth and everything on it will be found to deserve judgment." So you cannot escape God's judgment, but only through his son, Jesus. That is the only way. By the blood of Christ are you and I redeemed because of his perfect sacrifice. And so when we put our faith in him, we are fine. We are good to go. But if we ignore him, then judgment will definitely come on us. So let's finish off Jeremiah 3:23, knowing that we find salvation in Christ. "Our worship of idols on the hills and our religious orgies on the mountains are a delusion. Only in the Lord our God will Israel ever find salvation. Only in the Lord our God will our nations find salvation. Keep the faith, for the wrath of the Lamb will one day reckon. But keep the faith, and you will do fine."